All right. Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. My name is Daniel Pecoraro. I'm one of the senior program managers here at the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Hosting this week, we're talking with Molly Beer about Angelica for Love and Country in a Time of Revolution. Thank you. If you'd like to contribute to our program, Sam has dropped a link in the chat. You can also email us to learn more about how to support the show. Thank you, as always, for your support. Once again, I'm Daniel Pecoraro. I'll be hosting the first half of the program. My colleague Sam Dinney, who's one of our graduate fellows, will be moderating the second half of the program, answering questions from y'all, from the audience. And let us get things started. I'm pleased to introduce Molly Beer, who's a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Before this, Professor Beer taught in the creative writing department as an Olive B. O'Connor Fellow at Colgate, and Angelica is her debut book. Molly Beer, welcome to Book Breaks.
Thank you so much for having me, Daniel.
It's so great to have you here. Let's get started and tell us a bit more about this book.
Sure. So the best way to start talking about this book is to tell a little bit about why I wrote it. I grew up in Western New York in the town of Angelica, and it's a farm town. It's culturally northernmost Appalachia. In the 1980s, when I was a kid, it was you're struggling with the agriculture crisis that was affecting the whole country. And so I would ride my school bus past the farms that were struggling, and then I would go past Angelica's house on the Angelica Central School Bus on the way to drive through town and around the park circle that is designed after Paris as an arrondissement, which is obviously an Angelica touch, to the Angelica Central School, where I learned all of my American history through the lens of Angelica, because that was what was interesting to me. And then I grew up and I started teaching and I started thinking about, literature and women and so forth and what brings women in. And I thought I just had this immensely privileged childhood, even growing up in the agriculture crisis on a dairy farm, because I had a woman in history who I followed and looked up to. And so when the play came out, I had already written about her a great deal, trying to write about what my town was like, where I was from, and stuff. Every time I tried to explain where I was from, I would bring in Angelica, but people didn't really know who she was, or if they did, they'd been, the stories that had heard about her were more of the romantic interest of Alexander Hamilton or romantic interest of Thomas Jefferson. And I was like, no, she was, in my town we're biased because we got the story through her family, and we're like, no, she was really influential and important. And so I basically went on this quest to find out what her actual story was. And so we get this book, and her story is, it just blew my mind. I mean, I went in already like enthused about her and having imagined her a lot. But once I got into it, just to roll through the American Revolution and the founding era with her story, she's just everywhere. I mean, she's like a Forrest Gump of the American Revolution. I mean, she's born in 1756, the first year of the French and Indian War, in Dutch speaking Albany, New York. She doesn't even, she in homes, people were still speaking Dutch until the, quartering English soldiers in their homes changed that. So her name wasn't even Angelica. She was Engeltje in Dutch. And then, 1766, she has Stamp Act riots right at her front door. She winds up moving as a 10-year-old in with the royal governor of the colony of New York as sort of a peace gesture between upstate New York and Manhattan, and also sort of trying to show that things were stable in the colony, even as they were not. By 1776, the year the Declaration of Independence is issued, she's 20 years old, the week that Common Sense is published in the newspaper. A year after that, she elopes with this guy her family doesn't approve of, and goes off to try to join the war, which they do very badly for a while. Until they join the French army, Rochambeau's French expeditionary forces. And then she really goes to war, and she starts to get her footing as someone who is actually not along for the ride of the turbulent era in which she lives, but actually helping to shape it. And she goes on to France for the peace. England after that, where she's really a prominent American after the peace, who's, an avowed patriot of the American separated independent America, but is also living amongst influential Britons, and her husband winds up in Parliament, so she has a lot of connections on both sides, and she just starts to wield influence across France during the French Revolution, to the new United States, in England, and then she returns to the U.S. for sort of that turbulent, uber partisan conflict-ridden era of the late 1790s and the early 1800s, and she still has her finger in everything from the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson's regime and so forth. So she's just everywhere, and the American Revolution is told through men all the time. And when we get women, they're like knitting socks, and it's really hard as a girl to be like, "Wow, I can't wait to grow up and knit some socks." And so, I wrote this book because I was like, I just feel like if we're going to tell this story about how this country was founded, now, obviously, there are a lot of viewpoints that I'm not representing in this book, but women's viewpoint has been really left out. And that's what I set out to do.
So many strands here that we're going to try and pick up on,
So many,
and put some pins in at different points in time. But I also wanted to, from that, get a sense of what the research process was like for this book. And in fact, I noticed in the notes that some of the pieces that you used in researching this book came from the Gilda Lehrman collection.
They did. They did. Um, and elsewhere. I mean, people say like, oh, well, the reason there aren't books about women from this time period is like there just aren't any resources. Their letters haven't been kept. And sometimes that's true. I mean, right here at my institution, not Gilder Lehrman, but the Clements Library here in Ann Arbor, which has a renowned Revolutionary War collection. And they have the Nathaniel Green papers, and you open up the Nathaniel. It says Nathaniel Green and Catherine Littlefield Green, and these are their papers. And actually, what's in the collection are only Nathaniel Green's letters, and Catherine's are all missing. Now, she may have gotten rid of them herself. Women have done this forever to sort of erase themselves from the story as a way to aggrandize their husbands, to not make it look like their husbands were too strongly influenced by women. If you sew, you want your stitches to be invisible. Like, I'm totally not sweating here. This is just glistening. That dinner party I pulled off was no work at all. Raising my children, it's all effortlessly. We erase the work of women. And so I think a lot of times that has happened to the letters, but really what happened is it just exploded open. I mean, in my hometown, they have the collection in the library there. Lucy Knox's papers are at Gilder Lehrman, and she and Angelica were together in Boston for a while, trying to maybe be friends, but maybe not. And it just like there were some people kept her letters. She was viewed as important in her time. Thomas Jefferson kept her letters there at the University of Virginia. Alexander Hamilton kept her letters. They're in the Library of Congress. Her sister, between her and her sister, through all the years she was abroad. Particularly women have been safeguarding this history for a long time. And when I started to look, I mean, even at her house in my town, the people who own it, they have this file cabinet like with trays, and what they have in it are shards of ceramics that they've picked out of the like old dump behind the house, like excavating her story there. So like all of her dishes shards are still, there just was so much stuff, and the town has kept it. And it would just, if my editor hadn't kept me under control, this book would have been 3 times as big as it is, frankly.
I, I, I imagine that's the case with a lot of the books that we feature on Book Breaks. So shout out to editors. Um,
Yes, seriously.
so you start the book with a look at childbirth in the colonies. What did Katharina Schuyler, Engeltia's mother, have to endure to bring her into the world? And was that emblematic of the colonial women or colonial women of means experience?
I mean, obviously, I'm not in the room with Katrina Schuyler at the moment when she's giving birth to her first daughter. So a lot of this is drawn from books about childbearing and midwifery and the colonies. And yes, there are more of those that pertain to women of privilege, like Katrina Schuyler. Um, but I I started with the birth because I wanted to just take this whole story and shift it to a female perspective. And in the colonial period especially, the role women are playing is populating. I mean, Benjamin Franklin wrote his piece on, I'm going to forget the title. Um, Yep, nope, it's not there. But wrote a whole tract about, how American women are having children and how, we want to have native born children, like by which he means white children, to populate this new country. I mean, he explicitly says white. I'm not even extrapolating that. Um, and and so that was the role women were taking, and it was a cause. We can look at colonialism now and be like, oh, it's so problematic, but this is what they were doing. This was what their lives were. This is what they were told to do in church, was to like make right in the wilderness, is how people phrased it. So you plant your rows of crops, you grow your rows of children, and you populate the space. And that was the project that Angelica's mother was part of. And so to sort of contrast that phase into, I mean, obviously Angelica had a lot of children too, but to bring it into that, like, what's going on with this generation? How is the next generation distinct? How is the generation after that distinct? To sort of isolate those, and to show women's role in all of that. I mean, that women had such a critical role in colonization. Um, you know, Russell Shorto has a great book talking about like the first women who like were brought from Europe to New York, and that was really important for that cause. Um, and yeah, so I want to start with the birth, just to locate this as a women's story and a women's perspective and what women's lives were like through this period, but also to show the contrast between the generations.
And I'll come back to the role of women in these generations. Kind of a couple more questions on this front, but sticking to these early years for Angelica, to what extent did her upbringing in Dutch-speaking New York, as you mentioned, especially following the 7 Years' War, impact her early life?
Yeah, I mean, so even though New York had been a Dutch colony, and and Angelica is growing up in a Dutch speaking household, but also speaking English in public, and she's sent to boarding school at 8 to New York to learn French. So but she's always sort of an other um, in New York. The British are never like, oh yes, we embrace the Dutchness of our New York colony, just the way the Dutch have sort of been erased from American history, even though there are some pretty significant elements of, Santa Claus and cookies and capitalism and things like that we think of as being distinctly American, that can be traced to the Dutch colony. She's still very other in the British hierarchy. So I think that experience for her is what makes it possible for her later on to be someone who's living across cultures, or when she's working with the French army, to be the person who's able to translate culture a little more objectively, because she has been an outsider in New England. She understands that space of like, how do I fit in a British household, having grown up in a Dutch household? How do I move to New England, which is really a homogenous space, and and enter this social world? How do I go to France and enter that social world? How do I go to England? And I think that experience of growing up, one, in a more multicultural space that was New York, even in the colonial era, but also being a little bit of a border space all the time. She's got British people living in her home. She has Native Americans who are coming to her home to meet with her father about land and business matters. She's, the close to Quebec is Montreal is not far away. She just is in this space that's a border space. And I think that impacts everything she does after that.
And so, with that in mind, in terms of you know this in betweenness ends up being throughout the book. How does that something that Angelica uses as an asset? Because there's so much here that's along the lines of basically the importance of Angelica as a diplomatic figure, which kind of bridging between these different lands, these different regimes. Can you speak a bit more to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's great. So when I went into this book, if you write a biography of Thomas Jefferson or Alexander Hamilton, there are 145 biographies of Thomas Jefferson, the way has been cleared for you a little bit. The path exists. You just are looking at different scenery. And with this one, it was like pure bushwhacking. And so I didn't know if I was going to find anything. I mean, I didn't know if I would find she was significant or if I was going to find she was actually a really vapid person who just was like tagging along for the ride. And it was an interesting ride because it's an interesting era, but like, really, was she doing anything? And the pattern that I kept finding, I mean, from her early childhood, and some of it imposed upon her through her adulthood is exactly what you're saying, like putting herself in the middle. I mean, so when she's 10 years old and um, the Stamp Act riots have taken place, and there are more land tenure riots taking place specifically in New York and what becomes the Hudson Valley. And they're trying to, keep this peace, a tentative peace in the colony. And she is sent to live with Governor Henry Moore as a child, but is also this symbol. So she's the Dutch, and it's also a girl space, right? So marrying someone has always been a way to like create ties between two parties or two political bodies or two countries, or so this is commonly a role that women were playing at the time. She's the exact same age as Marie Antoinette. So, in terms of an Austrian, future princess of France. So she goes in that role. And then later she's in Boston as a young woman, and General Burgoyne's British invasion of upstate New York has taken place. Her father has been humiliated by it. General Burgoyne has specifically burned her family's farmhouse, and but then gone on to the Battle of Saratoga, which the British lost. And then he stays as a guest of the Schuylers instead of taking over their house for Christmas, as he had planned to do if his invasion had been successful. And then he comes as a prisoner of war to Boston, and he invites Angelica and her sister, Elizabeth, to come to their ball in their prisoner of war camp. And she goes, even though Boston tells them not to associate with them. And that's a matter of, recognizing the peace that the British have made after the Battle of Saratoga, and being like, if we're going to have war, we also have to make peace. And that's an actually requires an action. It's not something that just like, oh, the war ended, now we have peace. You have to actually go create that. So she is like, yes, we're going to go dance with the British who have surrendered to the Continental Congress to recognize to honor that surrender. She does that. When she's with the French, again, she is the American translator between the French army and the Americans, which is useful because New England is very Protestant. The French are Catholic. We've been having a lot of religious wars. They're not inclined to get along. There are some social spaces that there are prime for culture clash. For example, the French have to be told that you can't kiss men in the street. That becomes a problem. And so she's the person who's like, okay, let me tell you how you behave in New England in this time period so that we don't have any problems. And so she's again sort of like a cultural interlocutor. And then she goes to Britain, and she puts herself smack dab in the middle of a war that has just happened. And they buy a house next to King George III's Windsor Castle, not next to, it's like 2 miles up the river. And, just steps into that social scene as a prominent American. Peace has been made. The war is over. And so she's there, not being like, oh, I wish we were still Britain, but being like, now I'm an American and I'm a prominent American and I expect to be invited to your party as such. So sort of forcing British society to accept the consequences of the war and perform those manners that at the time were seen as so critical, to acknowledge that peace. So she does that. And then, later back in New York, when things are so fraught, she's the person who Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who couldn't be more different in their politics. Well, they could be, but they think they couldn't be more different in their politics. We've got this vast, like, partisan divide, and everyone's like, we're going to have a French Revolution on our hands any minute from now. Both Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton write to Angelica. They both adore her. They both like see her as like this ideal for what American society is going to look like once we get this government under control. And things like when Aaron Burr and her husband fight a duel together, she goes to a party with Aaron Burr as her guest. We have had the conflict is over, now we're making peace, we need to get along. So she's constantly in these in-between spaces. And I was really thrilled to find that pattern because I was like, well, what does women's power look like? What does women's influence look like? And she's unique, but she's not. Like there are lots of women playing this role of like, let's knit this society together, let's like suture this problem between us and make everyone behave, I guess. But that's certainly a space she occupied.
Yeah, you had this line that really stuck with me in chapter 18 of in public in England as in France, she was performing what it was to be an American. So I feel like that really got to the core of the nature of that performance. Um, this next question is because this was a fascinating through line here. How did Angelica, her husband John, and Lucy Knox come in league with privateers?
Yeah. I was fascinated by that too, because piracy is weirdly attractive. And apparently it was for them too. So in Boston, after so at the beginning of the war, it's really located in Boston, but then it sort of relocates elsewhere, and you have that invasion from Canada, and you have General Howe moving on Philadelphia and the British at New York, and so Boston is no longer the seat of the conflict. Um, but the city has been ravaged by the fighting, and wartime prices are out of control, and the British are messing with US currency just to make it worse, and inflation is insane, and people can't afford anything on what they have. So, you know, one, it's like, how are we going to make money when we can't? A lot of men are gone, at the war. And so women are sort of like, well, how can I make money? Because I still got to pay all the bills. And now butter costs like, woo. So for Lucy Knox specifically, it's like trying to maintain her lifestyle that she starts investing in privateer ventures. Um, and Angelica and John, have a bit of a gambler side, which was not uncommon. Like you read a lot about gambling at this time period. So privateering, which was legal piracy. So in a time of war, ships could get a license to attack ships that sailed under the flag of the enemy nation. So if you're an American ship, you could go get a license to attack British ships. And it doesn't just mean warships. It means like they're merchant ships. They're the ships that are bringing supplies for troops and so on. And so, and if you captured one by the law of the sea, you could divvy up the prize of that ship. So the ship would be sold, and all of its cargo would be sold. And you as the privateering vessel could do it. So if you bought a share, it's like stock market, right? You could buy a share in a privateer venture, and if it cashed in, you would then get your share of the payout. So without other sources of income, a lot of Bostonians, they say Boston was privateering mad. A lot of Bostonians were like buying shares of these ventures, and people were refitting their whaling vessels to go chase down English ships. And John Carter, Angelica's husband, as he was known at this time, gets really into this, and they strike some big prizes early on, and then he gets excited and tries to go even bigger, and you'll have to read it to see where that goes. But it was also, George Washington was not thrilled about the privateering because he was like, well, people who might be soldiers would rather go privateering because if they catch a ship, like they come home loaded. And obviously, continental soldiers were making nothing. So that was a problem, but there wasn't much of a continental navy. There was a little one, but it helped the cause that there was these sort of like guerrilla naval expeditions going out menacing the British, even if it just meant the British had to send extra security when they sent, or had to get extra insurance so it's causing prices to rise in England. And that helped, Benjamin Franklin encouraged it on that basis. He's like, keep at it because this is obnoxious to the British.
So a couple of through lines here in the book. While we still have the first half hour before I hand things over to Sam. The first, which really connects through the entirety, is the relationship between the Schuyler family to the institution of slavery.
Mm.
What was Angelica's relationship to slavery like, and how did it evolve?
Yeah. So, um, at the onset of the American Revolution, slavery is ubiquitous through the American colonies and legal everywhere. And but it's manifest differently in different colonies, which allows people to be like, oh well, our kind of slavery is better than your kind of slavery, and blah, blah, blah. So which is obviously deeply problematic. Um, in in New York, particularly upstate New York, while there were sort of plantation styles enslavement situations, specifically the Johnson family, Sir William Johnson and Sir John Johnson, who are royalists, have 60 slaves on their enslaved 60 people on their um, property that they have this vast property that they've been acquiring as the Indian commissioners. So they're buying more and more territory from the Native Americans in that area, and then they're farming it, so they're bringing in more slaves to do that. Um, in but on the Schuyler's farm, um, it was not seen as economical. I'm not going to give anyone, like, no one's exonerated here. Like, everybody's participates in this guilt. You can be like, well, women don't own property, but like again, like women are still in charge of running the household, which means managing the enslaved people. Um, uh, but the enslaved people were used more in the domestic realm, and then they were hiring farmers or hiring workers to work on the farms because it would be seasonal, and that way people who wanted to be buying property would come and they would work on these farms for a while, and then they would build the money to like become freeholders. But in Angelica's family, in the Dutch communities, like Sojourner Truth grew up speaking Dutch. I mean so the enslaved communities in northern New York are part of these Dutch families, and they to the point where that's their first language. They had, I mean, this is this crazy thing. They had like a ceremony, a bondage ceremony with the children, where they would pair a young white child with a young black child, and they would have a little ceremony, and the white child would give a pair of shoes to the black child to symbolize their bondage, and then they would be raised from very young to be a pair like that was they were trained by both parents um to their roles. So I find that really fascinating to sort of like look at how deeply embedded in the family it was. Um, and then, but it evolves over the revolution. People talking about, let's talk about liberation for women, let's talk about liberation for the enslaved people. And that conversation she's exposed to everywhere. So when she has her first child in 1778, they do acquire an enslaved child. He's the only person that I find in their household at that time who is enslaved. And I suspect there were more, but there's no record whatsoever of them um, who would have belonged to her parents. So I know that she and John own at least one child, and but then she starts to spend time with the French, and the French are appalled by American slavery. I mean, to the point where General Rochambeau's son tries to smuggle enslaved people out of Virginia, went after Yorktown back to the north to try to, take them to France where they will be free. She does spend most of her adulthood in France and England, where domestic enslavement is not prominent. She does not take Ben, who is the enslaved child. Um, she finds another household and gives him or sells him. There's not really a lot of it, but the rule was this child was not to be sold to anyone but to her. Um, and I don't find more records of him after that. But so yeah, no, I mean, it was a big part of her life. She was in Virginia where they were, after the Battle of Yorktown, she's in Virginia with the French army, where she's seeing the chattel style enslavement, and and discussing it with General Lafayette, who is a friend of hers, who ultimately buys a plantation in the Caribbean, because he's going to like train the enslaved people on the plantation for freedom, and that fault Napoleon puts an end to that. But so it's a constant conversation, and and they never, by when her father dies, they manumit the enslaved people who are at the Schuyler Mansion. Um, and there are no enslaved people on the census for the church's house in New York at that point. But her children take two different paths. Her daughter winds up, with Pierre Toussaint, this hairdresser in New York, who's a prominent um, advocate for the Black community there. And her son, who winds up Angelica, leans into enslavement later on because he's struggling to keep things alive, and he really thinks he's going to be this great land baron. So it is a conflict throughout her life. It's something that she has to defend to the French if she's continuing to practice. It's something she doesn't end up practicing. There, Alexander Hamilton does purchase a woman, a laundress, before they return to New York, but that's the only time I see that. So it's hard to find in the records. I tried to bring it all in. I wanted to just make sure it was as present in the story as possible, so whole that whole world was as visible as I could make it, um, even if it meant leaning into some hypothetical to fill in the gaps where there was no records.
And since you invoked his name, I have to go to the other elephant in the room, which is the $10 founding father himself. And Angelica's story, I think, beyond the town and village of Angelica, definitely shed light, 10 years ago when the show came to the public and then to Broadway. But kind of, setting the record straight, how does Alexander Hamilton enter the picture for Angelica, for the Schuylers, and what would you describe as like the biggest misconception that this book helps to clear up about the true Angelica Schuyler?
Well, okay, so first of all, I love Hamilton the play. I just want to say that, because if there are fans here, I don't want you to think that I'm not a
No,
fan. Huge
I'm
fan.
literally wearing my
Yeah,
Schuyler
like, yeah. I
shirt for
mean, so
this.
like,
Like,
let's, yeah, that was amazing. That you just the phenomenon of the play is so huge, and I always get a little nervous. There's one of the publishers prepared a little image that they posted some of the things, and it says a vital corrective. But if you take the whole blurb, it's like about the American Revolution, the history, not like the play. But I was like, it's not a vital corrective to the play. Like, the play is perfect. Um, but yeah, so but the play is a play. It's historical fiction. Lin-Manuel Miranda would be the first person to tell you that the timelines have been adjusted for the sake of a mainstream Broadway play. For example, there was talk in Angelica and Alexander Hamilton's lifetime that they maybe were inappropriately connected. But that conversation was happening when they were in their 40s and married and had many children between them. And he was now a prominent political figure and susceptible to innuendo and scandal and so forth. But to bring the like moral compromise of that scenario doesn't fit the play. So they, rearrange it so when they meet, she's not married yet, he's not married yet, and they can sort of invoke that love story or that connection between them without grappling with the like complexities of, um, uh, you know, I mean, obviously they bring Mariah Reynolds, but so, so straightening out that, I'm using that term badly. Um, yeah, telling it in a different order so that we can see the characters without necessarily like getting as deep as you need to get to like deal with all the nuance of history and a political story. Um, but I mean, for sure that story existed about them in their lifetime. I think that they were probably kindred spirits and fast talking, and innuendo, like people who like to speak in a lot of double entendre. And, Angelica is described as saucy a lot. And, she has these wonderfully flirtatious letters between her and the Baron von Steuben, who is much older than her. And, so like, I think that was fun for her. I think that's the way that she talked. And then they had to sort of, clear it up in the public record a lot, because because he was, he had an affair. Was sort of seen as someone who is, maybe, uh, not as much of a straight shooter as people would have liked, but it's also a political story. So, uh, scandals get stuck on all of it. I mean, there's also people's have suggested the same thing about Angelica with Thomas Jefferson. They spent a winter together in Paris, on the heels of his maybe relationship with the artist Maria Cosway. Um, and she was who she was, and she's influencing these men, and they're writing to her in such a way that when people try to explain it, historians for the last 250 years, when they're explaining it, they're like, why is this woman showing up everywhere, and what is her influence? And that's commonly interpreted as, it must be a love interest. But they were very close. And I think that they were, I think in the beginning she was helping him with his reputation, and at the end he was helping her with hers. And then after his passing, she's certainly helping with how his legacy is dealt with. The funeral leaves from her front door. Alexander Hamilton's funeral leaves from her front door. Gouverneur Morris, who's also part of that funeral, responds to how the day went. Now, if you can imagine in our current era of political partisanship, if a sitting vice president were to shoot and kill the leader of the opposing political party, we would have an extraordinarily tense situation on our hands. And that's what happened when Alexander Hamilton was killed in the duel. Now, there was some space for dueling, but politically in that fraught environment, it was a really big deal. So and again, we're in that, like, how do we make peace, right? So how do we prevent partisanship from erupting into what Angelica has just witnessed in France with the French Revolution, where partisanship got so bananas that people are cutting off heads. And so they have a funeral that has sufficient pomp, but doesn't explode into a mob. But Gouverneur Morris said how easy it would have been to turn this crowd into a mob. And so yes, they were friends their whole lifetime. They were very dear to one another. They certainly talked and interacted in ways with one another that inspired chatter. And nobody writes that stuff down in the historical record. So if more went on, they did not leave a detailed, report of that for me to find in the archives at Gilder Lehrman.
It's sadly, historical lacunas end up that way. A couple of questions, then I'll hand things over to Sam, starting with our History Scholar of the Week. First, how can teachers potentially utilize this work, either on its own or in conjunction with some of the documents, or with Hamilton the Musical in their classrooms? And what do you hope readers take away with upon finishing?
Yeah, so I mean, this book has been picked up by like the Junior Library Guild, which was like my favorite. Which is to supply to libraries as a crossover young adult title, which I was really excited about, because I do want this to be a book, that high school and up or younger, certainly precocious readers younger could read and learn this history from this perspective of the women who lived it. And I think a lot of, speaking as a girl, so as a former girl, that it's American history can feel like it's a lot of like who's on what battlefield where, and then where did they go, and it's just a landscape that's devoid of recognizable figures. And I hope that changing that perspective, like offering a book from a different perspective, will help engage more uh, more readers. I mean, I don't want to say girls, but I hope more readers who are interested in like what was the daily life like what were they eating, what were they wearing, what was the like going on the news, what was it like to travel at that time, what was privateering, what what were parties like, what that sort of perspective rather than sort of a purely military or political you know we didn't just create an American government with the American Revolution. We created an American society. So we sort of use the word socialite. It's not a gendered word, but we use it in a gendered way to be almost derogatory. But like there were people who were consciously thinking about what will American society be like. And like the government and like everything else, there were a lot of rough drafts that, needed to get thrown out. And there are a lot of ways in which it could continue to get better. And, the American Revolution is not over. Like we're still working on getting those ideals like hammered out. Um, but that I hope that this book would let more readers into that story and make more Americans feel enfranchised in that story and part of that story, and that they have a stake in how this country started, and thus have a stake in how it manifests today. So that's my really idealistic hope for it. So for teachers, putting it in the hands of readers who maybe are not connecting with the conventional narrative, to offer that counterpoint. Um, and it is a life that rolls through the revolution. So while it doesn't hit every battle, it hits a lot of them. I mean, it hits sort of the major um, moments of the war, of the of the Constitution, the debate over the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, and then that founding era were sort of like, Angelica sails from England for George Washington's inauguration, so she doesn't miss the party, um, so so it's a way to tell. It's a book that tells that whole history with the through line of a single character. Um, so for people who are sort of like, I'm not connecting with this, it might help for certain readers there. Um, and the thing that also fascinates me, when you take the revolution, we often think of these things as portraits. George Washington was commander of the Continental Army and the first president. But like those things did not happen simultaneously. Like there's a large thread. We so often look at historical figures as their portrait instead of as their through line. And so I think that the time is really, I mean, it certainly is fascinating to me writing it. I was like, I can't believe like how this threads out over a lifetime. Like this really is a whole generation and a whole lifetime in which the founding era took place. And so to sort of break it up and tell it in that, on that thread, I think helps also see it as not just sort of like a spontaneous event that took place in 1776 and then it was all good. Um, because it is a process and it's a continuing process. And I think looking at that timeline is useful and, and narratively compelling, I hope.
Absolutely. This is a great way to shed this specific story to life and then having it serve as a lens. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to hand things over to Sam Dinney to ask some questions from the audience, starting with our History Scholar of the Week. Sam.
Thanks so much, Daniel and Professor Beer. This has been fascinating to listen to. I do research on women and gender in New England. So, the New York counterpart, this has been very helpful to get some context. So before I take the audience questions, as Daniel mentioned, I'd like to focus our attention on the History Scholar of the Week. And the History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guest a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card. And if you're a student watching this program currently or know a student who wants to submit a question, you can do so with the form found on our Book Breaks homepage. And so Markins from Union High School in Union, New Jersey asks, how has the modern cultural portrayal of Angelica Schuyler shaped or obscured her historical reality? And what are the implications for interpreting women's roles in the American Revolution?
Read me that first part one more time.
How has the modern cultural portrayal of Angelica Schuyler shaped or obscured her historical reality?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Hamilton the play, it has at least brought her into the cultural conversation, which is so thrilling for me. Because while I said as a kid I had this story forever, I had her story forever, and I had her as this locus in history that I was like, I am interested in this person. And so that helped me, I like care about a larger facet of history. So one, just like reintroducing her to the public is the critical thing that has happened with Hamilton. And that's, uh, and that's so important. I mean, we're always looking at history again and again and again and again through the lens of the situation in which we live. So, if you start reading books about Napoleon right now, you're going to be like, oh my goodness, if I live in this current like time period, like this resonates in so many different ways. And then 10 years from now, you read books about Napoleon, you're like, oh my goodness, like living through this political situation, this book resonates in so many different ways. So reintroducing history again and again and again through the lens of the moment in which we're living, um, it's so important, not for the history happened, right? Like that's that. But like why we go there is to help us understand the time in which we're living and how it connects to that history, and then how we got from there to here, and then how we're going to get forward. So studying the road that brought us to where we are helps us think critically about that and be like, well, here's what went right with that, and here's what didn't go so well. And, and here's, like, Sam, I'm curious what you think about this, but like women in Angelica's time were in one of those, I want to call it like a proto-feminist wave, but that's using terms wrong. But women had gotten rid of their corsets and they're wearing Grecian gowns that show their natural form and lets them move naturally, and they're not all like tied up, laced up, and like, it's a little see-through, it's a little diaphanous, it's, it's a um there are lots of books coming out from Mary Wollstonecraft to just a ton of books about that we, if you do feminist studies now, you're going to look back at those books and that era. And, there's certainly like sexual libertinage going on also. So you have some free love, you have some like we're wearing clothing that's freer. There are women in power. You have Catherine the Great. You have Marie Antoinette, who you can argue was not in a lot of power, but they had to cut off her head, which means someone was scared of her. So, Maria Theresa has been head of state of Austria. Catherine the Great is head of state in Russia. Um, and then you have this backlash that Angelica experiences towards the end of her life. And, there are great books on this, Revolutionary Backlash by, I'm not going to get her name right, but there's a great book called Revolutionary Backlash about the ways in which after the American Revolution, rights that American women thought were going to, spread to women as we move forward were sort of like ripped back. And we moved into an era of like button all the way up and like wear these huge gowns, and corsets came back into style. And so we have, so if we're looking at history in that sense, we can be like, we had this era where, and then this often happens after, like during war times, right, where women get pulled into the public sphere during wartime, and then the war ends and everyone's like, now go back, like go sit down and be quiet. So that happens to her a little bit. So that's sort of a trend that we identify in history again and again and again. And then, I take comfort sometimes in being like, well, this has happened before and we've progressed from it. But, so that's what I think that you get from revisiting those historical moments, in the present, and casting them in the new light that we have of our current, questions that we're asking as a society. Good
Yeah,
question.
for sure. And women in the American Revolution is such a complex, ambiguous topic. There's been so many books on it. And if anybody watching is interested, the book that Professor Beer mentioned, Revolutionary Backlash, is by Rosemary Zagari at George Mason.
Thank you.
Absolutely incredible book. It does show that, there was potential for a women's rights movement. But, as Professor Beer said, just, go sit down, the war's over. And so not to, continue with the Hamilton thread, but this question also touches upon a, very critical aspect of women's lives in this era, which is marriage. So Sam asked, my favorite song in the Hamilton musical is Angelica's song at Alexander and Eliza's wedding. but the motivation ascribed to her is historically inaccurate. Why did she marry the guy that she did? And did she disdain him as she did in the musical?
Well, marriages are long, like like history, no one's ever like in the same space in their marriage from the beginning to the end of it. That's why we just say happily ever after and then just like package it up. If you really talk about marriages, every marriage is a tragedy. Um, she, which doesn't make good Disney movies. Um, um, yeah, I mean, again, like when you're writing biography, even if someone has written something, you don't, we all write letters where we write our Instagram posts or we write our, our tweets and and we sort of tell the truth. But we tell our truth slant. So when you're reading the letters and someone says something about their relationship, you have to think about who they're talking to and why and what their motivations might be and like why they might be trying to make it look better or worse than it is and so on. So you're always in a nebulous space because you just can't be inside someone's head and know for sure like what does she really feel about her husband? I mean, she's there wasn't like an exit ramp, so you kind of have to make the best of it one way or the other. And they had ups and downs. They certainly their first 2 years were rocky. He's trying his privateering ventures. A lot of that goes up in flames. She's trying to like get a household going in Boston that's going to be a hub for people who are, she's the Baroness Riedsel, who was part of the German army with the British prisoners of war who would come socialize with her, and she'd grown up at the Prussian court, and Lucy Knox, and she's trying to build this but that also goes up in flames. So they have some hard times there. But then they stick together. I mean, she stays with the army except briefly when she goes to have a baby in Albany when they're marching on Yorktown. While Yorktown is going on, she is giving birth to her third child. And then immediately like head south to Virginia with said infant to be with her husband or to be with the army. I don't know if that's like a sense of like, I must always be with my husband, or if it's, I must always be with this army, or if it's both, that if supporting her husband is supporting the army. I think she's really invested in the army, but again, like you don't really know, you can't really know people's minds. They made a lot of money. He gave her a lot of, I mean, I shouldn't use that. She had a lot of liberty in the marriage. I mean, when she goes to spend the winter in Paris with Thomas Jefferson, she goes with her friend John Trumbull and her daughter, who's John Trumbull's goddaughter, and she goes for the winter to Paris. When she sails to New York to see George Washington inaugurated, she goes by herself with, she has a brother with her. She and her brother sail back to New York for that summer, but then she returns to England, with her maids only. So she has a lot of independence in the marriage. I can't like source it. Like, is it because he permits it? Is it because she insists on it? Is it because of a power imbalance between them? So they have a complex marriage. I mean, they have a lot of children. She is certainly sad for a long time. She's in England. She would like to come back to the country that they fought a war to liberate and create. And she writes that a lot to her sister, Alexander Hamilton, how great it must be to like live in the country that you're from. And, she's homesick. And he has a gambling problem at some point. And then when they get back to New York, and they come back in 1797, and she's only been back once that summer for the inauguration. And they're trepidatious, and they're maybe having some financial difficulties after having, run out of the money that they were famous for having. And they do the best they can. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously a dynamic marriage that they struggle through. Certainly I mean, what's fascinating for me as a researcher, and this is, they didn't choose this or make this, but a lot of times if you're researching women, they're so attached to the man that they're with that you can't like, like Lucy Knox, like what influence did Lucy Knox have? It's impossible to tease it apart from Henry Knox, like Katie Green. George Washington wanted Katie Green at every winter camp. She, Morristown, Valley Forge, she's everywhere. Um, and when George Washington thinks she's not going to be there, he, asks her to come. So what role is she playing? Possibly a huge one, but how do you tease it apart from Nathaniel Greene? Elizabeth Hamilton, how do you tease it apart, like her influence from Alexander Hamilton? Martha Washington, who I think had a great deal of influence in the winter there in Philadelphia, lobbying for money after Yorktown, where she has just come from the grave of her son to lobby Congress. I mean, how influential is Martha Washington? Again, we can't like separate them. But Angelica Church, because she's the American and John Church is English, because she's the person who has the influence with her friends in the US, and people sort of think he's a like profiteering banker. He's a man of a mere man of business is how he's described. So people didn't love him. And so fortunately for researching her, she is very distinct from him. And that's helpful too. So yeah, no, it's an interesting marriage and, and a complicated one.
For sure, yeah. And as you're speaking about this, I'm thinking of Abigail Adams, who is called, John Adams is basically Cabinet of One. Like everybody knew she was in the background there. And so I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question. I think this question really wraps up everything we've talked about really well. So this question is from Bob saying, getting ready for another year of making history relatable to middle school students. Wanted to point out that loved your example of Angelica as the female Forrest Gump. And so question is, how did you find her perspectives different as a female participant from the more traditional male guided narrative of colonial and revolutionary events?
Thank you, Bob. That's a tough one. Figures, we like come in with a hard one at the end. His middle schoolers are in trouble. No, I mean, so the rubric for greatness, right, is male skewed. Like, what battle did you fight in? What army did you command? And it matters the command. We don't record like women, like we do, or the enslaved people. We don't record the names of the foot soldiers. We say George Washington won the battle, but of course George Washington isn't running out there like waving his bayonet around. Like there are a lot of people who are part of that, and it's a larger social movement, and it includes the enslaved people who are there as servants or actually fighting in the stead of other of people who would otherwise have to go fight, and the women who are following the army. There are thousands of women involved in the army. But they don't qualify for greatness because they actually can't hold military rank. They can't qualify for on the rubric of like, what job did you have? Well, they can't have a job. So that again, like they're disqualified. Well, what were you elected to? Again, like disqualified. So like, so what I try to do is be like, well, what are the things women were doing, and how can we look at those as like locus of power or locus of influence and add it to that rubric? Now, obviously, we need to expand that farther, so we can get, obviously, the national picture is much bigger than the like five guys we tend to follow, and and part of the work is to sort of fill in the negative space of that national portrait, person by person or chapter by chapter to get a more comprehensive view. But yeah, I mean, narrative differences, like, women are raised on the same stories as men. So we often privilege the same stories as men and be like, oh, well, I'm just a woman. And you'll see that in their letters. Like Lucy Knox will spend like, oh, I'm just a woman. And she'll go on, I love, 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 love you. And then she'll drop on the like last page of her very long letter. Oh, by the way, I lost like 100 pounds on the Yankee hero. Please send money. So, so it can be harder to find because women will hide it. Skirts are designed to hide the work of walking. It's like, they're not out being like, let me tell you all the things that are great about me, because we're taught not to do that. And so finding it can be a little tougher, but and again, like they're using the same narrative structures because those are the ones, that's the grammar we have for understanding our times and our space. But But there's other, it lets in more of men's stories too, because men were the heads of households too, like Monticello, Mount Vernon, like how much of a stake Philip Schuyler had in his house. Men were known by their houses, and and we sort of like have since then been like the house is a private sphere, but it wasn't then. So that's not a complete answer, but I'm gonna get saved by the bell here, right, Sam?
Yeah, women were for sure running the show. And I just wanted to comment, I really liked your comment about shifting the locus of power, recognizing that, it's not all military rank. Women have this, huge role in the household, especially during the revolution. So just wanted to comment on that. And Daniel, I will hand it back over to you. Thank you, Professor Beer, for a great talk.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you to Molly for answering questions from our attendees. There's some questions we didn't get to. There's a whole section in the book on the duel between Aaron Burr and John Carter that involves the Manhattan Water Company, which I love too weedsy for this conversation. So to that end, buy the book. Before that, a reminder once again, History Scholar of the Week. If you're a middle or high school student or middle or high school teacher, please encourage your students to submit a question for a future edition. The student and the teacher each receive a $50 gift certificate to use in the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. As mentioned, once again, you can go to bookshop.org to purchase a copy of Angelica. That link should be in the chat. We receive a commission, supports our programming for history teachers and students. Next week, we have A. Wilson Green talking about a campaign of giants, the Battle for Petersburg, Volume 2, from the crater's aftermath to the Battle of Burgess Mill. That's next week, same time, same channel. You can go to gilderlehrman.org/bookbreaks to sign up for that session and to explore the archive of more than 250 hours of scholar presentations. And you can go to gilderlehrman.org for documents, including some of the documents featured in this very book. History Now essays, nominating a teacher for the National Teacher of the Year Award, online exhibitions, the Hamilton Education Program, and so much more. Once again, hope you have a great rest of your Sunday, a great week ahead. We'll see you next time on Book Breaks. So long, everyone.